Welcome to the podcast, What Would Jane Do?, where we take a light-hearted look at an 18th century perspective on 21st century problems. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but I'm also someone who adores Jane Austen. And I'm joined today by my partner in podcast crime, Kate Macfarlane. Kate, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm a civil servant by day and a reenactor at the weekends and some evenings as well. And I very much enjoy Jane Austen, as any woman of sense and discrimination would.
Excellent. And for those of you who are actually watching the visuals of this, you'll see that Kate has very appropriately dressed up for the occasion, making me feel as though I really didn't make enough of an effort. So I'll try and do harder next time. Today, we decided that we would pick a topic which seems to be quite a lot in the news as we look at the whole issue of gender in our age, and that is Jane Austen and ideas around masculinity. So that is what we're going to ask, what would Jane do about that? Now, I was led to this topic because Jane Austen is often cited as an inspiration for our favorite costume fantasy drama, Bridgerton, which definitely falls in the world of historical romance rather than historical fiction. And if you look at the heroes there, I'm not sure, beyond the superficial, what connection they have with Jane Austen. For a start, in Bridgerton, obviously they are mainly objects of sexual fantasy. And the whole program, as well as the comedy of it, there is an element where it just revolves around the attraction between couples and lots of hormones, shall we say. And in the first series, of course, the Duke's problems were all to do with sex, very graphically to do with sex. And when we also think about versions of the Regency period, you only have to think of Regency romances with, the heroine with the dress falling off and the hero of his shirt coming adrift. Now, let's turn to Jane. Absolutely not. There is no dresses do not fall off, and men remained appropriately attired.
Yes, you wouldn't keep your tailor very long if your clothes kept falling off, that's for sure.
No, or you were a terrible seamstress.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's turn to real models of masculinity at Jane's time, and we'll have a look at her own take on it, and then we'll move to think about what she might make of our modern version of men. Okay, so Kate, my opening thoughts on this was the point in history in which she is born. So in the 1770s, right at the start of her life, really what's going on there is a very different kind of masculinity. It was the era of the fop and of the macaroni. Now, as you're the costume expert, you must have looked at what the fops and the macaronis wore. Maybe you've seen some in museums. Tell us what they would look like.
Well, as ever with fashion, it was very extreme fashion. So not your person in the streets kind of wear, maybe your person in the street in fashionable London. The whole point of fops and macaronis were they were using very extreme versions of the fashions of the day. So lots of colour and extreme colour, as many feathers, gilding, braid, extreme brocade trousers, very high red heels, sometimes canes, and lots of jewellery. So it was definitely more is more. And you had men at the time wearing quite full-skirted, long jackets, cut steel buttons, embroidered buttons, fabulously embroidered jackets and waistcoats. It was displaying your wealth, basically, as well as your taste, however extreme that might be. And of course, there were lots and lots of, this was a caricaturist dream. They were almost pushed to satirize it, because if you wanted to be seen, you were going to extreme lengths. So you'd have the highest wigs, coloured wigs. You had men with pink and blue wigs, men with ribbons dangling off them, ring on every finger. Snuff boxes were very popular. So if anyone's ever watched The Scarlet Pimpernel or read The Scarlet Pimpernel, you'd be flicking your snuff box open with a single hand and taking an ostentatious sniff of your perfectly blended snuff. there were all sorts of ways of displaying your wealth, showing you were a man of taste and distinction. And it was very much of showing off, definitely, showing that you didn't need to work as well. So you had very full lace cuffs, lots of lace, and the lace was incredibly expensive to make, of course, frothing from your throat. You'd have ribbons on your hat, ribbons on your cane. You'd be mincing down the street. And these were, not necessarily gay men at all, but they were displaying their wealth, displaying their status, lots of silks, satins, clothes that you would never do a day's work in, that's for sure.
And if you're sort of thinking of contemporary, well, not that contemporary now, but I always think of that Adamant song.
Yes,
it's that, because the 80s played with these tropes as well, didn't they, in the New Romantic movement?
Yes, Adamant in Stand and Deliver was Dandy Highwayman. That sort of Adamant was, of course, borrowing stage costume from all over the shop, but sort of melding almost the 1790s and the later Regency fashions, because he was wearing Napoleonic sort of hussar's jacket at one point and a cocked hat, a tricorn from the other. But that idea of playing with masculinity almost, again, they would have worn in the 1790s, they might have worn, especially in the court, pale-faced makeup with rouge on their cheeks. And part of that was possibly to cover pox scars or anything else like that, to cover up any issues you might have had health-wise. Pastilles to sweeten your breath. They were very, very much concerned with the look of something, and basically saying, I am upper class, I don't need to work for a living, here's my wealth, and look at me, basically. It was all about, and it wasn't necessarily so much sexual, although it could come across like that. If anyone's ever watched Dangerous Liaisons with John Malkovich, that you can appear very sexy in that outfit, and you can appear quite dominant in that outfit. But it was also as much about displaying your wealth, saying, I am upper status, you can't touch me.
Yeah, and it was a very artificial look.
Oh, very.
And powder, and it went along with a social sort of set of manners, which was all about the thing that was prized in society was your wit and your conversation. That's very often, if you look in literature, the thing that is said about somebody, or even in politics. Sheridan, for example, the political leader, but also the owner of Drury Lane, was very much made famous by his eloquence and his wit. And it was like the crown jewels. If you had that, you were made in society, because you were invited everywhere.
Absolutely. And there's a really good film, if you ever get a chance to see it, called Ridicule. I think it's a French film, and it's about life at the French court and the French hierarchy just before the French Revolution. And they demonstrate very clearly your status, and people one-upping each other with jests and often very boorish pranks in the court. They were clearly a load of people who were incredibly bored, tethered to the French court, if you like, because they had to be. And in fashion, certainly in about the sort of just before the French Revolution anyway, the French hierarchy was all tethered to the court, whereas the British people of high status were very much managing their estates in the country. And yes, they did come to London for the season, but very much it was all about managing your big house in the country as much as attending court. So French court was a very rarefied atmosphere. And yes, you were very much judged on your wit, your ability to create poetry, your clothes, and it was probably ridiculous to our eyes levels of etiquette. The way you entered a room, who you followed into a room. You could spend days just going and probably getting incredibly lost in the amount of etiquette you had to follow. And this was a life of the rarefied people who didn't have anything really else to do with their time other than ridicule each other for entertainment. It was sort of Lord of the Flies, but in a court situation. So all of these people, it wasn't very healthy for them from a social sense to have so much wealth and so little to do with it.
And then there was a revolution. So we're actually now going to be thinking about what happened as a reaction to this foppishness, this over colourful, over I suppose one of the words that was knocking around at the time as a reaction is effeminate. The idea that men are sort of dressing themselves up, that's the job for women, or at least this is where we move to, because onto the stage, and extremely influential, is Beau Brummell, who brings in a code of dress which in fact a lot of men are still following today, did they but know. And in brief, this is much more what people are familiar with from watching the films about Jane Austen. It's the breeches in a sort of single color, like a tan or something, or cream, and then a solid colored coat, possibly a little flourish in the waistcoat, but definitely a white linen shirt with a beautiful cravat, neatly tied, but also a move away from the wig and the powder.
Yes, and we've talked about how fashion moves in cycles. So whatever the extreme was at one point, it's gradually going to move to the other end of the scale, isn't it? And Beau Brummell, I think of his style basically leading to the black and white tux we see today. It's very much a plain but beautifully cut silhouette for the body, white or pale underclothes and a dark jacket or dark trousers possibly, and the cravat evolving into the bow tie. But it's all about, and Beau Brummell definitely was all about you making the clothes, not the clothes making you, and sorting out your appearance so that it was cut to flatter you, but in a very subtle way.
Yeah, so this goes along with a code about being a gentleman, being what it was to be masculine. Of course, this takes just as much effort as being the fop, or even more perhaps, because it goes down to tiny details. And there is stories of people going to watch Beau Brummell tie his ballet, tie his cravat to sort of learn the art of being a gentleman. So let's not pretend this didn't take an effort, but it does have within it a code of behavior of how men are differentiated from women after an era when perhaps they were equally excessive in dress. There was a real step away from that for men, more women too, but definitely for men. And also sort of coming into society are some values which we definitely see picked up more in the Victorian era. The importance of physical fitness. This goes along with codes of the colonial ambition to sort of go out and, it's the whole terrible world of the white man's burden, isn't it? Very suspect. But anyway, there's a whole sort of ethos about the sort of perfect physical specimen, an appreciation of boxing and fencing. So it's quite different. It is the swing of the pendulum. And within this period, you've got an interesting figure who kind of shows you how people react, which is the Prince Regent, whose tastes were very much still, if he had his way, he would still be being a fop, let's face it. So he put his, even though Beau Brummell was his friend until they fell out, but he liked dressing up in uniforms of lots of gold braid and what have you, and he loved excess, and he was mocked for that.
And I do feel a bit sorry for the Prince Regent. He was one of a large family. The family were already on slightly dicey ground coming from abroad, so they'd get mocked for being Germanic. And also, I think he would have wanted to join the army and to have adventures because there was so much going on in the world at the time, but he wouldn't have been allowed to. And this is the dilemma of the princes of today in England, isn't it? Although they did manage to sneak out there before the press discovered them. But it's very difficult being almost the figurehead of the country. You're expected to have a certain presence. And in his youth, I think the Prince Regent was known as Prince Florizel, and he was very handsome and held up as a very attractive person. And unfortunately, due to a life of excess and idleness, and certainly a lot of hangers-on around him, probably encouraging him to excess, to be honest, especially if he was a bit bored and at a loose end and all he basically could do was spend money. I'm sure he was encouraged in that by all the suppliers. So if it didn't move, he'd gild it. And he was famous, yes, for having a vast array of beautiful uniforms and being and basically almost pretending that he'd been to places, even though he hadn't, and it probably put people a bit off when he said, "Oh yes, don't you remember when we were in the peninsula," or something like that, and they just went, "Yeah, right."
So even though he's the head of state, eventually, well, he's the Prince Regent because his father's not well,
No.
but he isn't regarded as the model that you would aspire to, I don't think.
He was very much, I mean, they called him the Prince of Wales, and that's Whales,
Yeah.
isn't it? Because he just grew very gross and fat. He probably didn't move around very much, or if he did, it was in very heated, stuffy environments with lots of wine near hand. So yes, he sort of got to indulge himself in everything, and that's not going to give you a great complexion or any level of fitness, is it?
No. So where did they look for their models? Well, the one that immediately came to me was the one that's sort of an 1810s predominant model, and that's the Germanic Byronic, with the word Byron in there intentionally. The stormy, glowering hero is kind of strides on. He probably arrived earlier, actually, in the Gothic novel, but there he was the villain. Now he is the hero. And many modern historical romance have this glowering hero as their main character. Sometimes he's a Viking, sometimes he's a duke of somewhere, but you can see that he actually is rooted in the phenomenal fame of Lord Byron, who not only his self-image was this, but also his heroes reflected the same thing. So people were reading the Giaour and other books like that, Childe Harold's Progress, those sorts of poems, and this became a fantasy, an ideal. And Byron, of course, who I think was a pretty ropey person, actually, in many ways, he did manage to solidify his own image by having a heroic death. He died of fever, but he was fighting for the cause of Greek independence. So how more masculine can you get in this world of going away and actually fighting for a cause? And in a sense, the latter end of his life is a bit of a rehabilitation in some ways. And then just to sort of finish up on the Byronic hero before I hand over to you, Kate, by what that might have looked like. Thinking about how it's produced and reproduced, you then see the acting style of someone like Edmund Kean sort of heading that way. He's talked about having flashing eyes and an intense personality. So they love this sort of it's the mad, bad and dangerous to know frisson becomes a sort of version of masculinity.
Absolutely.
So what would a Byronic hero wear? If you want to, if you're listening to this and think, I want to go and be a Byronic hero,
definitely, I think, as we mentioned in your last podcast, louche. And by louche, I mean things undone, carelessly flung on. You may have spent several hours, of course, achieving this carelessness, but looking like you don't really care, but you're still wearing gorgeous attire. Definitely the exotic. So you might have a sort of velvet turban, or a sort of shawl carelessly flung across you, a satin sash with a Turkish dagger stuck through it, and definitely dark and brooding. You've got to be dark and brooding. So I imagine a lot of stolid Englishmen who had their country estates, and they were kind of ruddy-faced, one step up from farmers probably, were feeling a bit put out by this person coming onto their stage and basically giving them just like the influencers of today, giving them almost impossible sexual standards to live up to. But I think it's that exoticism, the rise of the Gothic, very much the rise of Romanticism as it kind of trickles down today. It's a fantastical hero, and I have actually struggled through the Mysteries of Udolpho. I don't know if anyone's ever read this.
Yes. You have to read it as a history student. I'm afraid I've read all of her works. It's more than just that,
Yeah, and I loved it. Once I got into the language and it's enormous amounts of romantic description. But interestingly, the hero in that, as I recall, and it's a long time since I've read it, was it somebody called like Florizel, or I think it began with an F, Fondant. Somebody who was held up anyway as the hero of the piece, and of course then there was an anti-hero to battle him, and I do remember thinking at the time that the chap that we were supposed to admire was really uninteresting and very wimpy, and he was golden haired, rosy cheeked, and he always seemed to be reacting in a very unmasculine way to my way of thinking. The heroine was constantly fainting into his arms. I think every other chapter she was fainting. So I had no patience for either of them by the end of it, and I was rather rooting for the anti-hero. And I think the anti-hero or the villain of the piece was far more of what we would think of these days as a Byronic sort of romantic hero. He was probably dark-avised and had, locks falling over his forehead and skulking about and brooding everywhere and devising incredibly complicated torture devices or ways of kidnapping the heroine for no obvious reason that I could see other than just to sort of get in her way. But the whole point was, it was like the telenovas, possibly, of the soap operas of today. They basically just kept getting into scrapes and by some amazing way getting out of them that was totally unplausible, and falling into each other's arms in a totally platonic way, obviously, because no sex. We're British at that point. But there was always sex implied. And for me, actually, sex implied is far sexier than sex going on in front of you.
Yeah, well, we'll come on to that in a minute. I mean, definitely, there's another discussion, Kate, to be had about the male Gothic and the female Gothic. But anyway, yes, definitely, where this brooding that goes on to people like Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights is from this. I suppose it might even begin with Milton and Satan. The infernal energy. But anyway, it's got a lineage. But by the time we get to Jane Austen, there is definitely this version of the dark-haired, brooding stranger, which you see sort of played on in some ways in the Pride and Prejudice introductions to Darcy. But there's one important thing about the idea of masculinity I don't want us to miss, and that is the absolute importance in the real world of honor as well as in novels.
Yes, absolutely.
You get it as a plot twist in novels, but if you actually look in real life, people are really fighting novels. So Richard Brinsley Sheridan, who I mentioned earlier, he fought 2 duels with the same man over a woman who eventually became Sheridan's wife, but Sheridan almost died after the second duel. They took this really seriously.
Absolutely.
And politicians also fought. There's the most famous of these in the UK is between Canning and Castlereagh, who are actually fighting over a political bit of shenanigans that's been going on. And this took place in 1809. Canning apparently was a terrible shot and missed by a yard, but Castlereagh hit him in the thigh, which could have been fatal if you think about it.
You could have bled out.
Pretty
and
serious.
Let's not forget, I often give a talk or listen to our surgeon giving a talk in my reenactment unit. People would have died not necessarily from being hit by a bullet and the surgeon lopping your leg off. They would have more likely died from shock or infection a few days later. And the bullet is about 1-inch diameter lead, and most obviously the dueling pistols would have been smaller, but it could have carried in cloth, shards of bone, dirt into your wounds and infected you. And at that time they were incredibly good at after a few wars at surgery, but they weren't so good. They understood that the wound was infected, but they didn't quite see how to cure it. There were still doctors around there bleeding people, which obviously made people feel a lot worse. So although they did their best attempts to stop infection, they didn't really have as many things as we do today to help with that.
Also, we need to mention, of course, Hamilton and Aaron Burr over in the States, who a little bit earlier was doing the same thing. So this is a global version of masculinity in terms of Western culture, at any rate.
Yes, definitely.
And I think the thing to understand about duels is it doesn't really matter who wins. Well, it does matter, but what matters is that you turn up and stand and face the bullet.
Yes, absolutely. And actual soldiers of the time would have had to stand there in their ranks, shoulder to shoulder, and see the enemy approaching and get to about within 100 yards of you. So you literally would be able to see the whites of their eyes and know that that bullet was coming at you. It's unbelievable levels of courage. It wasn't stupidity. They knew exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. And that was just the accepted norm of warfare at the time, because your gun, your musket, only had a sort of 100 yards a way of hitting you. So you had to get that close to somebody. And there were cannons firing at you and all sorts of things. Dueling, same sort of principle of you would rather die, literally, than be seen to be a coward and not face your fate like a man. And it seems almost incredible today that people would have thought that way and had that amount of importance of honor. But duty, which we hear so little of today, was very much a real thing. You had and I was thinking to myself, what, as a Regency woman, what would I think of as a quality of masculinity in Regency times? And I came up with very similar to you. So definitely the sporting aspect. You'd expect your masculine man to be boxing, riding, shooting, fencing, gambling, dueling, driving a carriage. You'd expect them to be informed, have a level of intelligence, so be aware of poetry, the arts, world travel, politics, sciences, such as they were, and of course have an education in the classics. Witty, as we've mentioned, they would definitely have a use of language, be very good at speaking and speak a second language probably. Be a provider, so that was attractive. Be rich, obviously, be able to provide a home and security for their family and look after their sisters and brothers, as Jane Austen's brother was expected to do. Looks were important. You wanted someone that was reasonably fit, and that went with being sporty as well, I should think. Fashionable, healthy, as well as wealthy. You wanted your attractive person to survive. And they would be fashionable, but not a slave to fashion, necessarily. And behavior. And I think Jane Austen particularly focuses on behavior as an attractive masculine trait above anything else, I would say. Polite, kind, their actions should show that they're responsible, looking after their dependents and their family, and those less fortunate than themselves. And I think in terms of dueling, it was tied up with, I'm a responsible member of society, I stand by my word. And a gentleman's word was literally his bond. If you were at the gambling tables and you said, I bet, thousands of pounds on the roll of this dice, and then you couldn't follow through with that, that's why a lot of people did commit suicide, because it was a debt of honor. And a debt of honor, again, it seems impossible to us these days, was far more important than a debt to your tailor. So the poor tradesman could go hang, but if you owed your friend money that you'd bet at the gambling tables, great houses were lost on the roll of a dice, because you wouldn't think of re-engaging on that. And I think in the 33rd Foot, I think it was the 33rd, there was this awful officer that was just a firebrand and basically forced duels on people, and he was famous for it. And they eventually were trying to sort of ship him off somewhere because he kept killing officers in duels just for the heck of it, just because he could and because he was a very good marksman. So there obviously it went the other way, and it was a problem. And some officers had ridiculous quarrels over things like a dog. I mean, you think, well, why on earth would you kill each other over a dog? So people would force quarrels on each other. People would take it to extremes like anything else. But at its most serious, if you had an argument with someone and there was just no way that either of you were going to back down and resolve that argument, one way you could settle it was in a duel. And it was understood there were definite rules of dueling. Your seconds would try and talk you out of it for obvious reasons. But if you were both going to duel, it was understood that you could delope. That means fire in the air. So acknowledge that a duel was taking place and that it was very serious, but you didn't necessarily want to kill somebody over it.
So from this sort of febrile world of dueling and Byronic heroes and all this sort of thing, let's turn now to Jane Austen's world. You've touched on some of the qualities there, but I think what's really apparent is the different temperature of her world from what we've described. If you think about it, there is very little physical description of anybody in Jane Austen's work. There's no.
I always find that very, very interesting, because having read an enormous amount of romances in the spirit of research, obviously, you will always, there's almost archetypal romantic heroes, and they go into enormous lengths. You know what the hero or the heroine looks like from top to toe. And it's normally a Barbara Cartland kind of description of gilded hair, lips like roses, flashing dark eyes. And they're always, you know the color of their eyes, the shape of their eyebrow, their inside leg measurement. Jane Austen does talk about someone as being handsome, pretty, tolerable, and then she just leaves that and goes straight into their character, which is actually more interesting. And that, for me, works better in a romance novel, because you can fashion then the romantic ideal of your imagination as opposed to relying on the authors.
And there's barely any physical contact between, unlike the sort of Bridgerton, let's all jump into bed. And I think that would have been regarded as tasteless or immodest.
Oh, definitely.
On the part of the woman. But I think also it would have been, in Jane Austen's world, a man who behaved like that in mixed company would also be regarded, mixed company of the same, not when he's down the pub or but when he's in polite society. There's this division of worlds, I suppose we're saying, where different forms of masculinity are played out, and Jane Austen's one is of the polite society.
Yes, very much.
So I think, like you, why Jane Austen is much more sexy really is because the journey of her men and women are from a sort of aloofness to true intimacy.
And it's intimacy of the mind as much as the body.
Yeah. Oh, completely. That's where the intimacy happens.
Yeah.
Just pure physical intimacy, sex isn't sexy. It's transactional. Whereas what she looks at is how you fall in love and what the attraction is when you fall in love with the person, not the
exactly.
Not the
and do you think that it's true what they say about women being far more attracted through thoughts than visuals necessarily, and men, it's all about how somebody looks? I mean, that's a very sweeping generalization, obviously, but why women enjoy novels so much is that it can all go on in their heads, and they can fill in the gaps, and they can see it unfurling. I mean, I'm a very visual person, so I almost see books unraveling like a film in front of me. But it's women are very good at filling in the gaps, I would say, as a generalization, and imagining a lot of the romance and what's going on behind the scenes. And I think that's why they're particularly attracted. And it's quite amusing, actually, as somebody who uses Facebook and belongs to several Jane Austen societies, the amount of arguing that goes on as to what so-and-so should look like, or which version of film that you like, because it's almost like they don't like seeing films sometimes because the director has not, or the person who's cast doesn't fit how they see that character. And it's quite contentious. I can see duels starting over, whether you like the 1995 version or the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice. People can easily come to blows if they weren't on social media.
Well, I'm not going to answer on behalf of my sex. That's a very Jane Austen way of putting it. But I do think it's true that Jane Austen had that perception. That so that's what floats her boat. is a really intelligent, lively, witty, there's a spark.
Yes.
So let's look
I am attracted to somebody's looks. Obviously, I think we all are. That's what we see first, isn't it? But if there's nothing behind those looks, I very quickly get turned off. And I think the people I'm attracted to most in film and television look like you can have a conversation with them as well. Look like they've got charisma. If they've got very sort of pretty, bland looks, it takes you so far. But as soon as they open their mouth and nothing intelligent comes out, that's me turned off completely.
So let's look at the qualities of our heroes, and then we'll look at the villains or the bad guys.
Yep.
So the thing that I sort of wrote down first is honesty.
Yes.
That totally seems to be the thing which defines. If the person is a good egg, they're honest, even if what they're being honest about is actually hard to hear.
I mean, you can be very blunt, so that can be off-putting. I suppose you're thinking probably of Mr. Knightley putting Emma's welfare and being very honest to her and making her cry at one point. but he's doing it for her own good. So ultimately, she can see that he cares for her.
Yeah, it's the right kind of attention, isn't it? So he tells her when she's out of line with Miss Bates, whereas Frank Churchill is encouraging her to step into his more risky behavior, which is unkind.
Yeah.
So that's the next quality I picked out is kindness.
Yes, and they say, don't they?
Gentlemen, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And they say if you're attracted to somebody and you want to see how they behave, because initially when you meet someone, we're both on our best behavior and behaving in a way that's not necessarily our natural bent. So they say, don't look at how somebody treats somebody that they have something to gain an advantage of. Look at how they treat someone who they have nothing to gain any advantage of. Look at how they treat their inferiors, if you like. If you're a landed gentleman, do they treat their staff well? Do they treat their tenants well? And that's a very telling moment when Elizabeth goes to Pemberley and she hears from the housekeeper, who, yes, okay, has a vested interest, that he is the kindest master and he treats his servants very well. And that, for anybody reading the books at the time, and certainly now, gives you an insight straight away into Mr. Darcy's true character, because, you know, he doesn't have to treat them well. He doesn't even have to notice them. They could be beneath his notice if he was a bad master, and he could just treat them like furniture, as a lot of people did. But that is a very good clue for Elizabeth that, hey, you know, maybe there's something more to him underneath all his pride. And again, it's perception, isn't it? She sees his standoffishness as pride. It could also be seen as a defensive coat. Because a lot of people, especially if they're famous or they're rich or they've got something that somebody else wants, they can be pandered to. They can be told that they're wonderful, and it must get very, very wearing if you have people coming up to you all the time wanting things from you or wanting to gain by association with you. And I think possibly Mr. Darcy is good friends with Bingley, and there's some sort of, oh, why is he friends with Bingley? Bingley's sort of open and friendly, and because Bingley's a genuine person, and clearly Darcy picks up that Bingley doesn't really care how wealthy he is, and Bingley sort of jollies him out of his sullens a bit. But I see Darcy as not so much proud as having a protective coating to stop just anybody coming up to him and annoying him, basically. And he's probably quite a private person who finds being in public quite difficult.
That's a very modern problem.
It is,
so I can see that. But there's also the other heroes I immediately think of is Mr. Knightley asking Harriet to dance when she's been snubbed by Mr. Elton. So repairing her sort of reputation or the snub in front of society by offering her something even better than the vicar. And then in Persuasion, when Captain Wentworth, thank you. Captain Wentworth steps in to help Anne when the children are sort of climbing all over her.
And hands her into a carriage when he can see that she's tired of walking. And that's interesting too, isn't it? Because underlying that is Anne's up at that point has not really thought that she was in with a chance anymore, but she actually realizes he does still have a kernel burning there that maybe she can fan a bit.
Oh no! I don't think she. I think she understands that as his fundamental kindness.
Yes, and it is fundamentally kind. He's noticed she's tired, and I think she was probably feeling very neglected and unnoticed before that. But to even be noticed by him at that point, when she was probably feeling not at her best, was a hopeful moment, perhaps.
I don't think it's in any sense that she thinks he still likes her. I think she just thinks, oh yeah, it's more of a sadness that she missed out on a good one. And the other one, of course, is Colonel Brandon sending the piano to Marianne. So we've got usually there's some act that the hero does at some point in the book, which it's a bit like the Save the Cat thing. Do you know about Save the Cat? It's a
Save the Cat?
Yeah, it's a thing in screenwriting where a small act early on, i.e. they save the cat, shows you something that's sort of like the bigger key to their character.
Okay.
It's a version of what you were saying about look how they treat the waiter as opposed to me on the date. You know, it's that thing. So look
in fact, you can contrast what Colonel Brandon does with what Willoughby does, which is give Marianne a totally extravagant, useless present for her. In that he gives her a horse, doesn't he, as a present? Here, just have this horse. And of course, poor Eleanor's going, and how are we going to feed this? Who's going to groom this? Where are we going to store this? It's a totally thoughtless present, and Willoughby has to admit, I'll look after it for you. He didn't put any real thought behind that. He just thought, I'll make an extravagant gesture.
And also the other, pianos are all over the place, aren't they? Because you've also got, we're moving now to talk about the less reliable versions of masculinity. You've got the Gift of the Piano to Jane Fairfax by Frank Churchill, which superficially is really kind, but it also does whip up gossip and speculation about her, and there's something underhand about it. Yeah, it's like very underhand about it. And his flaw is that he isn't open, and they are in this secret engagement and they're hiding things. So whilst he's not a villain, he's also not a hero. There were flaws.
He's definitely not honest. He's sneaky, I suppose you could call it. He's selfish. He's doing this for his own benefit. He's doing this so that word does not get back to his rich aunt, I think it is, and she doesn't inherit him. And that was a very real fear, because it happened to Willoughby, didn't it? He was in danger of getting actually disinherited because she didn't approve of his lifestyle, possibly.
And it does happen to Edward Ferrars, of course, and he doesn't back down.
Yes, so, another person. So yes, there's a lot of similar themes going on, but used in different ways. So you don't necessarily notice the similarity.
So what about duels? I can't think of a duel. I know that there's inference in the Sense and Sensibility that Colonel Brandon, but I don't know that that's in the book. I can't remember. I don't think it is. But anyway, duels aren't very Jane Austen-esque, but there are definite moments of bravery where people show their honor by what they do. And I've just mentioned Edward Ferrars. He sticks by an engagement he does not want.
Yes, and that could have effectively ruined his life, couldn't it?
Yeah, he's going to be marrying this Lucy airhead.
Yeah, so he doesn't.
No, she's not an airhead. She's manipulative.
A woman that's totally unsuited for him. That he loved in his callow youth, and now he's an adult, sees the error of his ways and that they're not compatible. But also that he's losing his fortune. He could be destitute. They could both be destitute, and that, as a man, losing your ability to provide for your family would be a massive loss of faith. He would just have to have a totally different lifestyle, really, and he would probably lose all of the friends he had, who would cast him off if he couldn't do anything for them anymore. So it was a massive torment, really, for him to, but immensely honourable to stand by his word and to not go back on his word. And you can contrast that with the brother of Marianne and Ella, who gives his word right at the start to the father that he's going to care for them, and very swiftly gets talked out of that and leaving them with a pittance, really, of what he did originally promise.
It's the other brother, Robert Ferrars, who ends up marrying Lucy and ends up with the money. So Edmund's honour has cost him, but of course he gets, plot spoiler, he gets a happy ending, really, because you think Robert and Lucy, unless they're, I suppose they could just be obnoxious together in like the Elton, possibly, but it's not the happiness of rational people. Is it? No. So let's think about some of the more forms of masculinity that Jane Austen clearly doesn't like. And I think weakness. She really dislikes weakness, particularly when somebody, not physical weakness I'm talking about like spiritual
temptation.
Well, that, but also people who are under the thumb of others, particularly women. So a strong woman like Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who rides roughshod over Mr. Collins. Mrs. Elton coming in and riding roughshod over Mr. Elton with her barouche landau. I love that.
Yes, Mr. E.
Mr. E, yeah. And even Frank Churchill to extent, because I don't know how much it could be an excuse he makes so he doesn't have to do things he doesn't like, but he seems to be toing and froing from his home and doesn't give his biological father, much time. So there's an element of,
yes, he does come across as very self-centered, and going to London to get his hair cut, which Mr. Knightley is very dismissive of. It's a sign of his foppish, dandyish nature.
I thought that was to arrange the piano. There's
some, right, possibly.
You know what I mean? But yes, and he's clearly he hasn't got the responsibilities yet of actually running an estate. Mr. Elton, who does have responsibility of a parish, just seems a man child, and Mr. Collins, really, So if you read about Mr. Collins in another version of this, in the other Bennet sister, I sort of shifted my view slightly of Mr. Collins. Anyway, we shouldn't bring in outside text. And then,
no, I suppose.
So I think there's an element of people have to know their own mind and stick by it, but not to excess, because she also criticizes Captain Wentworth when he goes for the foolish girl because she's sticking by, the Musgroves. Which one does he end up with, or almost end up with?
Is it Louisa?
Louisa, that's it. Louisa, the one who jumps off the cob. So weakness in that sense is not approved. And silliness, silly men, though they make great characters, are also not approved of. I'm thinking here particularly of Emma's father with his hypochondria. And
I think it's a sign of selfishness, isn't it? Really, it's everybody must bow to my illness. I don't really care what the rest of you have to do with it. I'm going to finish this dinner party early because I want to go home.
I think he's a man who's just scared.
Yes, very scared.
I don't know that he wouldn't see it as being selfish. He just wants it's a exaggeration of that thing that parents feel of not wanting anyone to risk anything.
Yes, and not wanting anything to change. Yeah. I mean, the whole point of and infecting that with Emma is infected with that too, because she actually is almost paralyzed in moving forward in her life, because she says to Mr. Knightley, "Oh, I'd love to marry you, but I can't leave my father. This would practically kill him." So she's got a very real fear instilled by her father over many years of what would happen to him if she left him.
And there's also the silliness of Mr. Bennet not actually putting his foot down, just letting Lydia kind of do her own thing, putting off, someone who's not fully engaged. And then we move on to the really more wicked people. They're not. She doesn't go in for the real sort of murderous types, but we've got the dishonest, like seriously dishonest. We've got the Wickhams and the Willoughbys, and John Thorpe in Northanger Abbey.
Yes, John Thorpe I love because he translates so easily into modern sensibilities of masculinity, in that you can just see him talking so floridly about his wonderful horse and how fast it goes and how wild and dangerous it is, into somebody talking about their latest racing car, and how many miles to a gallon it does, and look, it's got twin engines and goodness knows how many exhausts and things like that, and it just translates absolutely into that. And I think again that is the whole point of Jane Austen for me, and why it's still so relevant today, is because she so clearly observes the foibles of people's behavior. That doesn't change, and 200 years later you can recognize people around you in Austen's characters, and indeed yourself in a lot of Austen's characters, in their different aspects, and that is why it is so relatable still.
And in the same book, of course, we have the closest to the Gothic villain, which is General Tilney.
Oh, he's wonderful. Yes, he's a complete tyrant.
His poor young girl in a coach on her own with no maid to accompany her or anything. I mean, that was very shocking behavior. It's literally...
It is. And if you really think about that, it is really dangerous, what he's done to her. He has cast her into jeopardy. Absolutely. She could be attacked. She's waiting in an inn yard in the middle of the night, all alone. And women that were all alone could be seen by some nefarious characters as unprotected and therefore fair game for anything, attacks, rape, you name it. So it was very brave of Catherine to make that journey home. I don't know if enough is spent in some dramas on the real danger that she was in at the time. And of course, Henry Tilney, the hero, is rightly horrified by this. So whatever misdemeanor Catherine has done before in her suppositions about his family tree is cancelled out utterly by the actions of his father. That's far worse.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a whole range of menfolk there. And I think it's noticeable that really, for me, the key to Jane Austen's characters is that I don't think of them primarily as men and women.
No.
I think of them as fully rounded people who are mellowing and moving towards an understanding. The fact that they're male and female is
incidental, really, isn't it?
It's part of the wedding bells aspect of it that we're moving to. But it will be just as interesting to read about two of her characters moving towards a closer friendship.
And I really don't think of, I know they're often called romances. I don't think of Jane Austen's novels as romances.
No.
I think of them first and foremost as character studies that happen to have an aspect of romance in them. And I think a lot of us love the side characters as much as the hero and heroine because they're so fascinating. They are so well developed, and we can recognize so much of our own little foibles and our neighbors' foibles in them. That is what the attraction is, and the romance is great. It's a satisfying conclusion to the books, but it's incidental, really. People go on a journey; they don't always get their just desserts, but it's the interactions between all of the characters that make it what it is.
And going back to where we started, we're talking about the fop and the Byronic hero. I think both of those extremes she would laugh at.
Well, look at Walter Elliot. If that isn't a fop, I don't know what is.
Yeah, well, he did grow up then, didn't he?
Yes, he did. but he's certainly not a Byronic hero. But he's a man who doesn't want to. And again, we can see this today if we look around hard enough. He's a man who doesn't want to lose his youth, and is clinging on with both hands, thinking himself still a bit of a dog, and having affairs with a much younger lady who is willing to kowtow to him. But he's sneering at anybody who's not very handsome or doesn't meet his standards of masculinity or beauty, sneering at the seaman for having a bronzed face and wrinkles and looking much older than he should be, and preening himself that he's maintained his face and figure mainly through doing absolutely nothing at all. So utter vanity, utter selfishness, again, but a very interesting character and a very funny character.
Yes. I mean, I think actually you've hit the nail on the head there. I think if you want to think, what does Jane Austen dislike about masculinity, that's the character you should look at. Okay, so coming to the end of our chat about masculinity, let's take it up to date. What do you think Jane Austen would make of our present day version of masculinity? The very, very first thing I thought of is that she would be bemused by the emphasis that we have on sex, basically. I don't mean that, not procreation or just fun, marital. And what I mean is people being seen as their sort of sex appeal is what they're about. So
I think she would see that as incredibly shallow.
Exactly. She would be asking, where is our emotional depth? So as much as I think Regé-Jean Page, yeah, I'll get that right, is gorgeous, I think he's actually a much more interesting person than he comes across as a really interesting person. That's part of his appeal.
Yes, he's got charisma as well as looks.
Yeah, that's right, and that matters. And I think that if she was writing that character, she would spend very little time on the what he looked like in the ballroom, but she would spend a lot of time on what he was like as a person. So looking at our sort of modern day versions of masculinity, where do you think she would come down on?
She's got such fodder. She just has to look at social media, never mind TV and film, and she's got such fodder. She would just have so many aspects to aim her quill at. I think she would be quite bemused by people carrying out pranks on each other, dancing on TikTok. I don't really know where she'd start because there's just so much out there for her to aim at in terms of, I think, she would definitely be bemused by just how much emphasis is placed on people's looks. One thing I think she would be quite confused by or even appalled by is plastic surgery, and not just that people do it, because that wouldn't be that unusual, but the extremes they go to. And you see people with putting in cheekbones and extra chins and maybe making themselves almost look monstrous, and still having that perception of their self that they actually look really good. It's a very strange psychology, if you like, of almost deluding yourself to the point of turning yourself into a monster, in the exaggeration that you can do to yourself, and that plastic surgeons will allow you to do to yourself.
Oh, well, but don't you think Sir Walter Elliot would be totally up there? He'd be up for it. He'd be having things tucked and nipped and dyed and the rest of it completely. He'd be
yes, I can definitely see Walter Elliot. There's a wonderful, I don't know if anyone ever watches Doctor Who, but there's a wonderful character who basically has so much plastic surgery that all that's left of her is a skin between poles. Yeah. And she goes, moisturize me, just to sort of stay alive, practically. But she's taken it to such an extent that there is nothing left of her except her stretched face, practically. And I can see Walter Elliot going down that road, definitely, to the point there's hardly any of the original Walter Elliot left.
I think it'd be, you sort of wish you did have the TARDIS, talking about Doctor Who, going to bring her to help us with our knots we've been getting ourselves in on the whole sex and gender thing. The idea that sort of, the J.K. Rowling versus the transgender community type stuff, which I have no wisdom on, so I'm not going to weigh in. But other than, it's very sad that we seem to have got ourselves into a point where people can't talk about it, and you need somebody of Jane Austen's wisdom and wit to
puncture the pomposity. And I think for me, it's very difficult, isn't it? It's the culture of not being able to agree to disagree. That's the problem. It's this culture of, I've got a view and you've got a view, but your view is the wrong view because it disagrees with my view, and we can't coexist at the same time. You're either with us or against us. You're either wrong or you're right, and you can't have degrees of where you meet in the middle and say, well, I understand your view, but I disagree with it because, and without fighting each other. And again, we may as well bring back dueling at this point.
But it does feel like that. And that's actually, thank you. That's a very good place to stop. But we need to move away from the council culture, which is the equivalent of dueling.
Do what Jonathan Swift would do and just take it to the extreme it's obviously heading towards.
Yeah. Oh, Kate, that's a very wise thought there. Okay, so thank you very much. I think we've romped our way through masculinity there. We were looking to see if there was any Jane Austen news, and it seems as though in terms of the London stage, the Pride and Prejudice sort of is having the problem that many shows are having, and it's, according to Variety, I think it was, is curtailing its run because of people not going to.
Yes, literal cancel culture. Bring back the stage.
Yeah,
well, I'm really hoping that, obviously, as we all are, that things circulate around and that the stage gets back again, because for my money, you can't beat seeing something live on the stage. It's a thrill like no other, and I definitely enjoy being part of an audience in a theatre and interact. You have that frisson with the actors and hearing music, and it's such a creative environment. It can't help but stimulate you.
Yeah, so
and that's very attractive.
We'll send our thoughts to the casts of these shows that are having these problems, and the actors who are missing on chances at the moment. So our thoughts are with them. So thank you very much, Kate. And I wonder what we're going to be discussing next month. But thank you very much.
Tune in and find out, viewers and listeners.